Hello everyone, welcome back to the Grim Dawn class examination. Today we are examining the Warlock, which is the combination of Occultist and Arcanist. Now if you're looking for a class that does pure magic damage, this is what you're looking at. Now, despite initial appearances, this class actually works relatively well together, which is fairly interesting, because of a very unique series of setups. So basically, as with most Arcanist-involved classes, you're really looking at what exclusive skill you want to build around, basically. And this is assuming you're not building pets, which is a completely separate story that I'm going to get into later on. So let's say you're going to go into Possession. Alright, so we're increasing our Chaos, Vitality, Poison, and Acid damage. That's fantastic. You can build pretty much anything here that isn't pet. You can get away with it. Probably not Bloody Pox, though. That you can if you want. It's still very effective here, but it's just not as effective as maybe some other things would be. But you can basically build whatever you want here. But what about Arcanist, if you're going Possession? What do you build there? Well, you have a couple of options. You do have a couple of options. First off, the passives are great. Inner Focus is great on this class regardless. Maven's Sphere is a staple of the class, obviously. And, of course, Mental Alacrity is fairly interesting, especially if you are looking to utilize, say, Dreeg's Evil Eye, that casting speed. And this is something I actually want to talk slightly about. If you want to be really bold, and you're feeling abnormally spicy, you can 100% run Mental Alacrity, get 12% extra casting speed, and utilize Dreeg's Evil Eye in place of your default weapon attack. It's strange, and it doesn't necessarily always work, but I have done it before, and it has worked before, and it's kind of hilarious. But you can do that if you really want to. There are a couple of other things you can do with Mental Alacrity, but it's just a really good skill overall for this. But besides that, Albrecht's Aether Ray, boom, Tainted Power. Now, this is something that I've found almost nobody actually talks about, but Tainted Power does not convert the fire damage to vitality damage, it converts the lightning damage. And you may notice that Albrecht's Aether Ray, by default, does not do lightning damage. Tainted Power is specifically to be used with Disintegration, which in fact does do lightning damage. So what Tainted Power converts Albrecht's Aether Ray into is a Chaos, Vitality, and Fire Beam. Which means, if you decide to go with a fairly interesting fire build, focused around the Chaos and the Vitality, you could absolutely go into the Hellhound, Slail's Witchfire, Sigil of Consumption, get some more fire damage in there with Destruction, Doombolt, and then you can either go with Possession, or you can go with Reckless Power and splash in Kalidor's Tempest if you want. You have options here. But do keep that in mind. This is something I cannot stress enough. Tainted Power requires Disintegration, because Disintegration is where the lightning damage comes from, that it converts into vitality damage. Albrecht's Aether Ray alone does fire and Aether, which means just Tainted Power and just Albrecht's Aether Ray is fire and chaos damage, which isn't bad, but you're throwing away half of the point of Tainted Power at that point. Keep that in mind. Now, see, this is a very interesting combination. I'm actually going to take a hot minute to talk about the three skills that are just going to broadly always be useful across the board here. For Arcanist, Inner Focus, obviously. Spirit is very important for this combination. Maven's Sphere, which nobody is surprised by. And Albrecht's Aether Ray. This one will surprise some people, but no matter how you're building, Albrecht's Aether Ray offers you something. Are you building Possession? Are you going to run Possession? Okay, great. Tainted Power, Disintegration. Hits like a steam engine, probably better than Doombolt, because it's consistent damage output, whereas Doombolt is not. It's just a quick shot, whereas Disintegration is consistent damage, and it does the same types of damage as Doombolt, plus fire. So, if you're going to be building Doombolt and you don't have equipment that specifically increases Doombolt, you're probably better off with Albrecht's Aether Ray modified under Tainted Power. What if I don't want Possession Professor? Reckless Power, pull away the tainted power. Oh look, you wouldn't even necessarily need Disintegration at this point because this is Aether and Fire damage. Hello, Reckless Power, Aether and Fire damage. That's great. You can go right on ahead, and under Reckless Power, you would be willing to go into Fabric of Reality at that point, and then do Sigil of Consumption and potentially Soil's Witchfire, both of which work great with Fabric of Reality. Increased Chaos damage, increased fire damage, so you're at least going to want Destruction. It works out very well here. You might actually be able to combine Doombolt with Albrecht's Aether Ray at this point, because Albrecht's Aether Ray is not under Tainted Power, and you could get some benefit out of Doombolt that way. But it's a thought that you can absolutely go in that direction completely, and you can, of course, throw in Kalidor's Tempest, or go all the way to Inferno if you want to. That's totally up to you. It's fantastic. Maybe you really want the Alexa's Flash Freeze for the extra fire resistance reduction. Now, I talk about this a lot. You've heard me talk about this with pretty much every time the Arcanist comes up. But it isn't quite as necessary with the Warlock here, because there's no overwhelming emphasis on fire damage specifically, even if you're building Reckless Power. The emphasis is more on the Aether damage side of things, so the fire resistance drop, while it is a nice touch, isn't strictly necessary, but Alexa's Flash Freeze is something you may want to consider if you're having a problem being surrounded. But overall, this is actually one of the few class combinations where I often don't build Alexa's Flash Freeze, even though I'm building fire damage. It just doesn't come up very often. And you almost never will care about Absolute Zero, because you're almost never doing physical damage at that point. So, while you can, and it can contribute decently well, it's something that you can usually replace with something that's going to fit better in. So, instead of Reckless Power, you could absolutely go with Star Pact. And even then, by building up the Disintegration, you're increasing that lightning damage there. Albrecht's Aether Ray can still provide some really impressive damage output, along, of course, with Trozan's Sky Shard, and potentially even the Summon Familiar if you want to go for that instead. Absolutely an option. Out of the three of these exclusive skills, it should be fairly obvious that Star Pact is probably the one that works the least. Yes, you convert Aether damage to cold damage, woo, but honestly, it doesn't really make a huge difference. So those would be the skills that I would sit down and say, yeah, these are the ones that you should really think about with Arcanist. But what about Occultist? What really works there? First off, what we're really going to be talking about here is going to be a bit surprising, but obviously, as we've mentioned, Sigil of Consumption is pretty consistently great here. Soil's Witchfire. No, I'm going to actually amend that, and either the Summon Familiar or the Hellhound. Now, you don't have to do a 100% pet build here. I very rarely do. It doesn't usually work out, but if you decide you want to go into a specific damage type that these enhance, then you're going to be wanting to go into one of these two. And even then, they can still cross over. You can build both. They are strong contributions to a lot of different builds that you can run here. So, generally, overall, they're worth considering. If you're going Reckless Power and you're going to be focusing on the Chaos and the Fire damage with all that Aether, Hellhound is great. If you're going to be going into Elemental damage, which is generally what you're going to be going into with Star Pact, because it already is enhancing 2 out of the 3 elements, go into Wiskandra's Elemental Exchange, maybe you get Panetti's Replicating Missiles, support with some Trozan's Sky Shard, grab the Crow, the Summon Familiar, level this all the way up to get Lightning Strike and Storm Spirit, which will be enhanced by your abilities as well, and then you grab Vulnerability for the Elemental Resistance decrease. And then that's basically all you'll be pulling here, theoretically speaking. And it works really great. The Crow heals you, it increases your elemental damage and resistances, and it does large quantities of lightning damage itself. And then with Vulnerability, that's just increased even further. If you decide to go for that, you don't need to, but it's an option. It's something you can consider. Now, the real problem with this overall build is actually one of its greatest strengths as well, which is the overwhelming emphasis on magic damage types. There is not really any physical form of damage. You have some bleeding out of bloody pox, and that's basically it. So if you come up against somebody who has a really high just magic defense in general, which is extremely few people, but they exist, you're going to have a hard time. You're also going to have a really hard time in PvP if people, assuming you play PvP, if people build their protections correctly. So, overall, it does work. These two work very well together. You can build a lot of abilities in conjunction and have them work very well. The only real exception to this would be two things. First off, Bonds of Bismillah you're not really going to build that often unless you're really dedicating yourself to the pet build, and without an exclusive skill to enhance pets, this is a very unwise choice. Putting one or the other into a build is fine, but you generally aren't going to be looking to be hyper-specializing in pets with this particular class. As useful as Vulnerability can be for the build overall, it can enhance all kinds of your damage outputs. If you're going with Possession, this decreases the Poison, Acid, and Vitality resistance. If you're going with the Star Pact and the Elemental resistance, or even if you're going with Reckless Power and splashing in some Electro's Flash Freeze, Vulnerability is great. The problem here is that Curse of Frailty is useless to this build, because there is almost no regular physical damage being enhanced. Yes, your weapon may be dealing physical damage, but after a certain point it probably isn't. Knowing how Occultists work, your weapon is probably going to wind up doing chaos damage, or vitality. Or possibly you're equipped with an Arcanist weapon that does Aether. You're just generally not going to see a lot of physical damage here, and the only bleeding that the build has is Bloody Pox, fairly obviously. So there's not a whole lot of use to Curse of Frailty as an individual standalone skill. It's in Vulnerability that it becomes actually worthwhile building. And again, while we're on the subject of Bloody Pox, this isn't something you're going to be building in this combination, although it does do Vitality and Poison Acid damage, and it has fantastic reduction to enemies' health. That's great, but at the end of the day, there are other abilities that are better enhanced by your other abilities. There's just no real point to building Bloody Pox. For Arcanist, there's very little you actually aren't going to at least be able to consider. Actually, frankly, everything here you can use if you want to, at least in specific combinations. Even Nullification, which, by the way, you'll notice decreases the target's elemental damage as well. But anyways, there's nothing really you couldn't build in Arcanist depending on what build you want to go for. But if you're going to be kind of improving this particular combination, pick an exclusive skill and kind of build around that, because I think that's where you're going to find the best success with this. There are a lot of other really interesting little combinations you can do with specific pieces of equipment, with this, that, and the other thing. It's a whole spiel, but overall, this combination can work out pretty much any way you build it. Again, Bloody Pox is a little bit questionable, but it still can work. Bonds of Bismillah, very questionable, but if you are really dedicated to using both the pets, then this could be useful in the long run. Will it really carry you all the way through to the end game? No, I don't think. This is going to be... I say that pets aren't that heavily nerfed where they're unusable, but this might be the class where I'm kind of like, maybe don't stick with this for the long term. Because just with just two pets in late Ultimate, unless all of your equipment enhances your pets, and you've got Bonds of Bismillah, which is a pretty significant dedication of both your skill points and your equipment, that's it. All of your hopes are riding on pets. So it's very high risk and not really that high enough a reward to justify that, personally. And of course, Curse of Frailty is fairly dead weight across the whole build. You're really just looking for vulnerability here. So, with that being said, all these kinds of interesting things you can do here, we are going to just leave it at the roughly 15-minute mark. Because there's not really a whole lot else I can say here, given what there is. I mean, Panetti's Replicating Missile is just good across the board. It just so happens that Albrecht's Aether Ray flows into Possession builds, where Albrecht's Aether Ray doesn't flow. I'm sorry, not Albrecht's Aether Ray, where Panetti's Replicating Missile doesn't flow into any kind of Possession build. So that's really why Albrecht's Aether Ray edges out Panetti's Replicating Missile, despite them both technically fulfilling the same function. Panetti's just doesn't shift into a cleaner Possession build like Albrecht's Aether Ray can. So, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. Have a great 24 hours.